All right. We're back at it again. Lexie, thank you for joining me to have I think, like we said, a very nerdy conversation potentially.
Possibly, very much so.
Well, we're here to talk about high altitude training and your work as exercise physiologist. So let's just jump into it. Like, why high altitude? Why is this something you wanted to pursue?
Yes, right. So I actually got my undergrad in exercise and sports science. I had an emphasis in working with the clinical population, and I had the opportunity to go on this like student exchange program. And I ended up at a little tiny school in Gunnison, Colorado called Western State Colorado University. And they had just started, right as I was finishing up my bachelor's degree, they had just started up this high altitude exercise physiology master's program. And I am just an outdoor adventure junkie. You will find me in the mountains at every possible moment that I can be, whether it's skiing, trail running, biking, mountain biking, all of the above. I was just so passionate about being able to find something I could do with my life that allowed me to be outside and doing the things I loved in the mountains, and while also being able to help other people. So when I graduated from my undergrad, I was like, you know what? I don't really know what is next for me right now, but this program sounds like a great opportunity to kind of bring all these different passions together.
I love it. I mean, this is, I think, a unique topic just because in the space of exercise, fitness, and wellness, it's not covered much. It
No,
just seems very uncommon to talk about this.
I would agree with you most definitely.
So let's dive into, I think this is going to be really new for a lot of
Mhm.
people in the business, but I think pretty relevant depending on where you live too. And things
Yes.
like I live in Colorado and I went from sea level pretty much in Washington state to almost 5,500 feet of elevation. There's a
Yes.
definite difference initially
Most
with that.
definitely.
So let's talk about kind of the nuts and bolts of basically the changes that occur in the body when exposed to different levels of altitude or when that starts to happen at certain levels of altitude.
Right, most definitely. So I always like to consider altitude almost as like a supplement or a medication. There's always like a dose response aspect that goes into that as well. So the more extreme the altitude you have, the more extreme your adaptations in your body may be, or maybe your reactions, depending on your history of being exposed to altitudes like that. So I always like to allude to the dose response relationship of it, but there are so many adaptations that occur when someone first goes to altitude. And these adaptations can start to occur around like 4,000 feet in elevation. That's considered a relatively low altitude, but we can work our way up on the scale and get up to like higher altitudes, and talking about like even the really high altitudes
Right.
like Mount Everest and the Matterhorn and all those things. So I think that's an important thing to consider when we're talking about these adaptations. But adaptations, we can divide this into like two categories, I would say. One would be like the acute, the short-term responses that the body has, and then the more chronic, long-term responses that the body has to altitude. And so the short-term acute adaptations that occur, these start to occur typically within 24 hours of being exposed to altitude. And some of these things can, like, one of the first things that usually starts to happen is your ventilation starts to increase. You'll start breathing more. And this is the body trying to, what is it? Utilize the less amount of oxygen in the air and increase that oxygen carrying capacity in the body. So your ventilation starts to go up, you start to breathe more. So we're getting more of that blood flow throughout the body. Um, Typically, we will also see a good amount of increase in urination. And this is one of the body's ways of changing, like trying to change the pH.
Yes.
Yeah.
That happened to me big time
Did
when I
it?
moved here. I couldn't stop pissing when I moved to Colorado. I was like, is something wrong with me? I was like, this is crazy.
Yes. Oh my gosh. How long did that happen for you?
Man, like a good month or so. I was like, I can't believe I'm getting up this much to go to the bathroom. Or like just during the day, I was going
Yeah.
way more than I normally was going.
Right. Right. And I think people can relate to that too, even if they aren't like at altitude, but they go to like go for a hike or something at
Yeah,
altitude. They're like, oh my gosh, I feel like I've been peeing so much. Like,
seriously.
yeah. So that's one of those first responses. That's actually a good sign. It means that the body is actually doing a great job of like getting this entire physiological process going and like these adaptations going. So that's a great response to have that. In fact, we might talk about this a bit later, but one of the altitude drugs that people sometimes take if they struggle with altitude sickness is Diamox. And one of the first things that it helps your body do is urinate more. So
Hmm.
it works on the similar pathways.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. So those are the two main short term. Oh, we also see the heart rate start to increase drastically right off the bat in that short term exposure to altitude. And that's just an effort for the body to carry that oxygen better throughout the body and be more efficient in utilizing the less amount of oxygen that's in the air.
Yeah, most
So
definitely. I also wonder about too, and was talking about acute things still, but I also like I'm a pretty good sleeper. I struggled sleeping as soon as we moved up here. What's the maybe the acute things that occur with sleep with less oxygen consumption at altitude?
right. Yeah, that's a great question. I really just kind of see that as a response. Like everything's kind of like amping up in the body. Like we see that more long term, we see an increase in metabolic rate and we kind of see this increased like level of perfusion. There's more capillaries that are built in the body. So I just wonder if maybe the body just has it's been amped up to a degree that maybe it just has a lot harder of a time calming down to rest
Mm,
at night. And simply the lower pressure of oxygen in the air just maybe contributing to less oxygen to the brain while we're sleeping, which usually that's the
right.
time when the brain's able to shut off and recuperate. But yeah.
Very interesting. So, at what altitude would you consider it's like starting to not be light anymore in your exposure?
Yes. Yes. So typically there's three categories we would kind of refer to when I was really uh, digging deep into all of these different topics and looking at research studies at different altitudes. And there's low, moderate, and high. And low is typically considered to be 6,500 feet or so and below, which is still, I mean, to me,
Still a
that's kind of
lot.
a moderate
Like, yeah.
altitude still. And then the moderate altitude was more like the 6,500 foot range to like 9,800, almost 10,000 feet in elevation. And then high altitude would essentially be like 10,000 feet of
Mhm.
elevation and above. So more extreme conditions for sure.
So, like if someone was going from sea level, pretty much sea level, to 10,000 feet of elevation, like living, what would be some of the
Right.
things you would see that a person would struggle with in terms of adapting to that environment?
Most definitely. So goodness, there's a lot of factors at play for sure. And I sometimes like to um I don't refer to like a stress bucket for people. I refer to this a lot when I'm working with people in their minerals and going through depletion and things like that. But I think when someone's stress bucket is like overflowing, that's when we'll start to see symptoms of like, okay, maybe the body's been under so much stress for so long that this is just like the tipping point, and now we're having a really hard time adapting. So I like to consider that for when someone goes to altitude. Like, how have you been? How has your health and overall well-being been before you were going to altitude? Like, did you feel pretty depleted before? Because that will definitely play into how your body is able to adapt when you're at these extreme altitudes and under these environmental stressors. And so I think that's definitely a key component. But I think some of the initial responses that are very common for a lot of people, if you're going from sea level to living long term at a higher altitude, is that increased urination, like you said, that decrease in sleep quality. You will see typically a change in actually the ideal substrate utilization for an individual. So typically the body likes to utilize fat for fuel in certain circumstances, and it actually switches over to primarily carbohydrates when you're
Mhm.
at altitude. And from a physiological standpoint, it kind of makes sense. It's like, okay, your body's like amping up its metabolism. It's going to need all this quick fuel to utilize and to keep these systems like amping up and being able to improve that oxygen carrying capacity through the body. So I noticed this because I actually moved from San Luis Obispo, California, which is a small little beach town, to Gunnison, Colorado at 7,800 feet in elevation. And for months, just like you had mentioned, I had poor sleep quality.
Yeah.
I noticed I was craving more carbs than ever. Like
Yes.
it was the weirdest thing.
I've been more hungry here than I've ever been in my entire life. I'm like so hungry
Yeah.
all the time.
Yeah. And I mean, it makes sense. Your metabolism this is one of the chronic adaptations to altitude is that metabolism stays cranked up, which is kind of an exciting thing. I mean,
Right.
I feel like it can kind of help a lot of metabolic syndromes. It can help in the disease process and things. If someone is struggling to lose some extra weight, hey, moving to altitude might be a great stimulus to kind of amp things up and get the body into more of that higher metabolic rate.
Yeah, there's, I was thinking something's going on with me and I just didn't click about the altitude part. And
Yeah.
and I've noticed some people I talk to when they go to altitude longer term, they get headaches with that. Can you
Right.
maybe talk a little bit about that and maybe some of the causes of that?
Right, most definitely. Have you talked to people that have experienced them long term, or is it
Not
more
long term,
short term?
just an
Okay.
acute
Okay.
change. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, most definitely. Typically that's an indicator that someone is maybe starting to experience some signs of altitude sickness, actually. It's not super like it's very interesting. It's very bio individually
Yeah,
based.
yeah.
Like some people experience headaches when they go to altitude and others don't. And from there's so much I feel like that goes into play. So it's hard to think of like what is the exact thing, but
Right.
the less amount of oxygen, the less amount of blood flow to the brain, probably causing that lightheadedness, that headache, and just the body giving you some red flags that, okay, maybe we need to tone down the stressor a little bit. Maybe we need to work on some electrolyte intake or some
Mm.
different things like that.
That is that's interesting. So talk a little bit about some of the signs and symptoms beyond headache for high altitude sickness.
Yes. So, if someone wants to go look this up when you're at home for this as well, and also maybe print out a thing to take with you while you're backpacking or in the mountains, it's a great resource to have. But I like to refer to the Lake Louise scale, the acute mountain sickness scale. And essentially, it's like a little scale of questions that you can ask yourself when you're at altitude. You'll give a rating of like, okay, have you experienced or how long have you been at altitude? Did you have a recent gain in elevation and you've been there for at least several hours? And then do you have one of the following symptoms? So it's a GI upset, so nausea or vomiting or a hard time keeping food down, fatigue or weakness in general, dizziness, lightheadedness, that headache that we're talking about, and then the difficulty sleeping. So you rate each one of those on a scale from like 0 to 3, 3 being the most extreme. And then you can tally up your totals. And it's like, okay, if you're in the lower third quadrant of results, that's probably a low risk of mountain sickness, acute mountain sickness. If you're in the moderate area, yeah, you're likely experiencing acute mountain sickness to some degree. It may
Mm.
not be extreme or severe, and you may be able to tolerate it and adapt a little bit. And then if you're up in the upper threshold, you're having a higher score with that scale. Typically, it's like, okay, we should probably go down to lower elevation and get out of this environment before symptoms progress.
Oh, interesting. And now, are there other treatments besides going to lower elevation that will help with, let's say, a moderate level of high altitude sickness?
Right. So if someone is, they know that they're typically susceptible to experiencing acute mountain sickness, and it's usually in that moderate range, there are certain interventions, like I mentioned the Diamox before. That's a really common medication for someone to take if they're traveling to altitude. Typically, we're talking about like really high altitudes when
Really
people
high, yeah.
utilize this, like going to Everest and
Yeah.
things like that. But I have heard of people using it like for during the Colorado 14ers. And I would always talk to a medical provider before taking a new medication or anything like that. But Diamox is the most common one, and it just works on those similar adaptation pathways in the body to help stimulate that natural response to the altitude. It does make you pee a lot, which is one of those acute responses. So it's very important to stay ultra hydrated
Yeah.
if you're going to take it. But that's probably one of the main things. And then I would just say being the best prepared that you can be, staying ultra hydrated ahead of time with a lot of electrolytes and things like that.
Yeah. No, and it makes a lot of sense. Let's talk a little about some chronic adaptations to exposure to high altitude. A little bit about
Right.
that.
Yeah, most definitely. So this is really fascinating. These acute adaptations we touched on, these are usually going to start to occur within that 24 hours of arriving to altitude, or at the 24-hour mark. About that's when we start adapting. And they'll usually last the first like 8 to 10 days. And then after around 8 to 10 days of exposure, the body will start tapping into these chronic adaptations that can help sustain life and good energy at altitude for a longer period of time. So some of the things that happen during this adaptation period is the body actually starts to grow. New angiogenesis occurs. So new capillaries beds are built. So this is pretty much your body's way of just improving like how we can carry and utilize that oxygen throughout the body. We typically see that initial elevated heart rate and stroke cardiac output. We
Yeah.
see those start to come back down to a more normal level with that chronic exposure. And we actually see in the long run, we see a decrease in cardiac output overall
Interesting.
because, yeah. So if you think about like if we're at sea level and we want to go for like a VO2 max,
Hmm.
we'll have more oxygen consumption available right there and be able to probably tap into like our 110% of like,
Yeah.
here we go, let's get it done as best as we can. At altitude, because of that stress, the environmental stressor, we're actually not able to hit that 100% of like, okay, this is our total VO2 max because of that oxygen carrying capacity, the decrease in cardiac output over time, and all of that. It's very interesting.
So would you say basically that if you're going to try to assess your VO2 max, you want to do that at sea level? Uh,
Yes,
not
yes,
at,
I would say
okay.
so, most definitely.
Okay, that makes now, is there an advantage though if you're training at, I'm not sure what the appropriate altitude would be for that. I mean,
Right.
this has happened that, I've learned about this, seen documentaries about this, but I'm just curious, like at what level of altitude we have to train to get the most benefit to have increased performance at sea level, let's say like on a VO2 max test.
Right, right. So I would say probably that moderate to high altitude range would
Yeah,
be ideal. So around like the 7,000 to
right.
10,000 feet in elevation,
Yeah.
ideally, because then you're not in the so extreme elements that you're
Yeah.
having, I hopefully not having a hard time sleeping or
Yeah.
having gut issues or headaches or things like that that might be associated with someone who's traveling there to train.
Yeah.
Um, so there's a lot of things that go into play. And I think it's important to consider, like you hear about the sports teams sometimes,
Yeah.
like going to altitude training camps. But it's really interesting because from the research we did and that I continue to dive into every now and then when there's new research put out there, it seems that most of those adaptations are lost within a couple days of coming back to
Oh,
sea level.
really? This is such a quick
Yeah.
change.
Right, right. You wouldn't expect it, but it's really fascinating. So I think maybe if a team were to go like train at altitude and then they came back like day before game day
Hmm.
and then did it, I think you might see some benefit from that. But within a couple days, the body actually starts to adjust back to being at that sea level and the partial pressure of oxygen there.
That is such a quick adaptation. I didn't realize it was that quick. The human body is amazing. And like just the change of homeostasis, the movement to like let's adjust back to this environment is so incredible, I feel like.
Right, right. we had a theory, or we were kind of diving into like different hypotheses and different ideas we had in grad school, and we really came to the conclusion that the live high, so living at a high altitude and training at a low elevation might be the ideal like biohacking model
Uh-huh.
for getting your maximum performance, because you're getting those benefits of living at altitude, those chronic adaptations of the better oxygen carrying capacity, um, things like that. And then you go down to sea level and then you're actually able to train at max capacity.
Right.
I mean, that's not realistic for many people,
Yeah,
but
I'm not sure how you achieve that in most places where you would go from a significant level of altitude to sea level. Like,
right.
I mean, you would have to live maybe like in a mountain place and then come down to the sea level. I mean,
Right.
how many places are like that? That one, you could afford to do that and had the time to do that.
Exactly.
It's difficult, I feel like.
Exactly.
Wow, that's incredible. So,
Yeah.
um, now let's start looking at what we would say high levels of altitude. So now
Mhm.
we're what 10,000 feet and beyond. What starts occurring in the body that is maybe positive, but also starts becoming negative?
Right. Great question. So essentially so are we talking short term or long term here?
Let's do both. Let's start short term and then
Okay.
move to long
Yeah.
term.
Yeah, so essentially it's all the same mechanisms at play. It's probably just going to be a little bit more of a severe response, or a more augmented response from the
Hmm.
body. So we will still see that increase in ventilation. Someone might experience like quite a bit of hyperventilation, which would be a lot more dramatic than maybe at a moderate altitude for sure. And I mean, it makes sense. Some people need the supplemental oxygen to like go to the summit of Mount Everest
Hmm.
or like other big mountains. So sometimes the body is just not capable of handling that significant amount of stress. And then we're thinking about the other environmental stressors, like you're getting closer to the sun too, and that's a lot more intense, and you're probably having more extreme weather patterns. And there's just all these elements at play. So I kind of think of that when we're talking about these really, really big mountains and doing endeavors there. There's a lot of things at play that we need to be able to consider. And especially the metabolic rate, we're just going to be burning through
Right.
fuels like so rapidly. Like you're going to need so much food and nutrients and minerals, probably more than you've ever eaten in your life, probably just to sleep at that altitude,
Wow.
because the body is amping up. Right.
Jeez, man.
Yeah.
That's incredible. But what point is it detrimental to the human body where it's like, well, this is a very large negative when we're at this
Hmm.
X level of elevation?
Right. I don't know a specific number or a specific elevation to be exact. I would love to do some more deep diving into this topic for sure, but it definitely seems to depend on the individual
Hmm.
and how much oxidative stress is like going on in the body, and if how much the body is able to handle that.
Is there a training effect where like the fitter you are going into altitude, the better response to altitude, or is there a different relationship there with that?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's so interesting because I've met like really super fit people and they're like, I just went to altitude and I got so sick and like I
Oh.
don't understand, and so
Hmm.
it just seems really, it seems like it's kind of vague sometimes. It's like
Yeah.
sometimes people tend to respond really well. And maybe that has to do with they've been exposed to altitude plenty of times in the past.
Hmm.
They've been able to increase their resiliency through it by that exposure. Maybe they grew up going to the mountains like on the weekends or at least a few times a year, and they never really had an issue with it.
Hmm.
So it kind of depends on like previous exposure. It can also depend on like how quickly someone is going up in elevation, like if
Okay.
they're pacing themselves or are taking a few days to slowly
Sure.
build up over time. Um, and then there was one more thing I was thinking of. Let's see. Um, I might have to come back
That's
to it.
okay. Well, I think like the exposure, it makes me start thinking like if you've always lived, let's say, near the beach your whole life and you
Yeah.
never like been a mountain person or gone to the mountains, I would think that unless you have some chemical makeup that buffers you, would be a pretty extreme response to being at altitude the first time. Maybe
Right.
that first time as an adult would be shocking, I would feel like.
I would agree with you. I think if the body has not been put into that sort of stressful environment before, it may have a little bit harder of a time acclimating, and you may need a little bit more time to get up there. And this actually, just remembered what I was going to
Okay.
mention. So the idea of cross acclimatization or cross adaptation. And so this is the idea that one environmental stressor, exposure to that, can help you better adapt to another environmental
Hmm.
stressor. And so, one of the examples I love is the concept of heat stress. So, utilizing like sauna and
Right.
exposing yourself to heat stress. And we know like the heat shock protein is
Right.
released, and we go down this whole rabbit hole, this cascade of effects in the body. And the fascinating thing about the heat shock protein is it actually shares similar pathways with HIF1 alpha, which is hypoxia inducible factor.
Ah,
It's a protein in the body which in normal oxygen, partial pressure of oxygen conditions, like at sea level, it's suppressed. That protein is suppressed
hmm.
and it's not active. When you go up in altitude and you're exposed to hypoxic conditions, the HIF1 alpha becomes active and it triggers that cascade of the acute and chronic adaptations.
Ah.
So the HIF1 alpha and the heat shock protein, they share similar metabolic pathways in the body. So it's kind of alluding to the idea that, wow, maybe if we don't have the opportunity to expose ourselves to altitude to prepare for traveling to altitude or for an event at altitude in the future, maybe we can expose ourselves to good amounts of heat in the form
Hmm.
of sauna use or maybe wearing a sauna suit while we're exercising, things like that. And that can help us better adapt.
I mean, that's just fascinating. That's pretty cool.
I
I
love
did
it.
not know that.
It's so cool.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I always love those documentaries about Everest and K2 and all these things. And because so much of it is about acclimatization
Yes.
and about what happens to the body physically when you start going higher and into these extreme levels of elevation and you see people walking and they're taking like one step and it feels like the
Yes.
biggest effort level. Can you speak a little bit to why the effort is so extreme at high levels of elevation?
Right. Yeah, I just totally get that visual in my mind of like
Right,
your
you see it.
legs feeling like lead, like slowly.
Yeah.
Um, yes, and really I believe that's just accounting for, there's so much less pressure of oxygen in the air and the body is not if we're not used to living with that low amount of pressure of oxygen in the air, our body's going to have to figure out how to like get every little blood cell with the oxygen to like every extremity. And like I just think of like our legs and our feet, like maybe our body's just really trying to keep all of that small amount of oxygen it has right then at our vital organs, and
Right.
the feet are feeling like lead and you're just really trying to push through that.
It actually makes sense because especially in those places it's very cold the higher you get and your
Yes.
body is shunting all this blood to your vital organs to keep you alive so then your
Yes.
appendages are getting really cold and it's
Yes.
just changing everything. It's I actually used to teach a lecture in exercise physiology about exercise in space.
Oh,
I always thought
cool.
this was like my favorite, that and altitude. I used to teach a little bit about that
Yeah.
purely just because it's amazing to see what happens when humans are exposed to extreme environments for
Right.
that. And I think that's why I was like, oh, altitude, I want to talk about this because I just don't think we talk about it enough. And the other thing
Mm.
is, we have people who are living in states that have significant altitude. And
Yes.
someone may listen to this and go, I've been feeling like crap, man. And I'm like,
Yeah.
maybe you
Yeah.
haven't thought about that this is a factor in you feeling not well. Maybe you have a
Right.
moderate level of altitude sickness and you just don't know it, but you think it's
Yes.
something else. That I thought was
Mm.
an interesting take too, you know.
Totally. Oh, I couldn't agree with you more. And like you said, it took you it was a couple of months to fully adapt to.
You know what it is? I feel this is the strangest thing. So I have felt the most optimal I've ever felt in my life living here at altitude.
Okay.
So it's been a net positive for me. But I've been
Right.
going to the urinating so much, it feels negative on some level.
You're right.
I'm like, I do not want to get up in the night, to keep going to the bath. It feels like I will go to the bathroom and within 30 minutes, it's like I have to go again a lot.
Oh my
And I'm
goodness.
just like, it
Yeah.
just keeps happening. And I'm like, this is annoying. Like, so then I
Yeah.
have to change my consumption of liquids in certain
Right.
times for that.
Right.
But when I first moved here, I gave that no thought. I didn't think about that. And then I
Right.
forgot what I was talking about. And they were like, well, you're living at like 5,500 feet. I was like, wait a minute. I was like, there's something to that, I think.
Makes sense, right? Yeah, there's so many factors. And I think that's a really good point of like, yeah, maybe people think they're experiencing some sort of sickness or illness and they can't pinpoint it. And hopefully this can maybe shed light on, well, altitude is a factor for that as well. So
It has to be. I
yeah.
just, especially when you're living in areas like of Colorado, like you said, Gunnison up here
Yes.
is pretty high. I wonder what I don't know if you know this. I don't know this, but anyone out there answer this for us. It's like which place in the United States that is very populated has the highest altitude that people live at. I wonder what
Hmm.
that place would be and
Yeah.
how extreme that is. I don't know, but I'd be curious to know that actually.
Right. I would be curious to know too. I'm not sure which town would have the most population at high altitude.
Yeah. And so I think it's just a curious thing. Now I wonder if you were born into a high altitude environment, how that would affect you over the course of your life.
Right. I think that's a great question. One of the trends I saw when I lived in Gunnison is most babies were not born at full term. There were a
Huh.
lot of premature babies. And so I'm not sure exactly what mechanism is at play there. Maybe going back to the stress bucket, like the oxidative stress levels are just building up over time. And we have that environmental factor. Then we have a woman that's pregnant. And,
Yeah.
maybe, I don't know. There's a lot of theories behind that.
That actually makes a lot of sense to me, especially like the amount of caloric consumption needed, oxygen
Yeah,
for two people, all, and you're getting
totally.
decreased levels of that. In that, it's
Hmm.
I'm this is just a very interesting topic because I think I just don't know a lot about it in terms of like some
Right,
of these questions or things we're discussing. Like, what if you were born
right.
into that? And what would that mean if you spent most of your life at a decent amount of altitude and then as an adult you move to sea level?
Yes, they have actually, there's some studies about tribes. I don't know the exact studies or the names of the tribes, but indigenous tribes that live at very high altitudes, like I think maybe down in Peru,
Okay.
Chile, areas like that. And they actually experience sort of a reverse of acute mountain
Mm,
sickness when they go down to sea level. And so it's kind of like the rules are reversed where they actually experience pretty negative side effects to their health when they travel
yeah.
down to sea level.
You know what it reminds me of the show Expanse, where humans, they have colonized the known universe or the solar system, and you have these belters, people who are born on asteroid belts, and
Wow.
and they depict this in the show. I think very interesting. There's a lot of science in it
Yeah.
that if you've lived there your whole life and you come to Earth, Earth is actually toxic for you because the gravity
Mm,
is too extreme. You didn't grow up in that gravity. So you actually can't
right.
live on Earth for that.
Totally.
And we actually think about this. This is a science. If we want humans to live on Mars, the gravity on Mars is different than it is on Earth. So what if a
Very much
human is
so.
born on Mars and lives their entire life there and becomes an adult and they want to visit Earth? Could they actually visit Earth without getting sick?
Right. Yeah.
I don't
Those
think
are
we're thinking
great
of that.
questions. Yeah. I mean, it all is intertwined, it all
Right.
applies, I believe. Yeah, it's so fascinating. And then I get so interested thinking about like even I mean, there's so much in the whole genetic realm, but
Yeah.
like our ancestors, it's like, okay, where were our like great grandparents living? Were they living at
Yeah.
altitude? Maybe does that impact my ability to, be able to live and thrive in a higher altitude, whereas
Yeah.
maybe my friend doesn't necessarily thrive at higher altitude. It's just so fascinating.
I didn't think about that. Is there a genetic component to uh, withstanding altitude or thriving or not thriving in altitude
Right.
for that?
I have not gotten down into that rabbit hole yet, but I would imagine just as any other like proteins in the body that can either be suppressed or activated and different gene transcription things. I would imagine that the altitude, the HIF1 alpha pathway
Yeah.
and like the heat shock protein would somehow be impacted there as
Yeah.
well.
Now, is there some things that products on the market or anything like chambers or whatever it may be that helps people to
Mm.
maybe get the benefits of altitude without being at altitude? That I'm trying to think. This is
Right.
probably not right. Hyperbaric sleep chambers and
Yeah.
things of that
Yeah.
nature. What are
Right.
products are out there that maybe help people get the benefits of altitude, high altitude, but not be there actually?
Yes, I think that so we did little research with the hypobaric chambers. Um I don't know a ton about the mechanisms behind them. It's just it's a little bit tricky because you need to know like exactly when you're going to altitude
Mm,
and these different how long you'll be taking to get up there. I know there's like altitude training masks
yeah,
and things like that, but to me it just sounds like you're kind of just depleting your
it
brain of
is.
oxygen.
It
Like
really is.
I honestly find like the cross acclimatization things to be a little bit better because I'm like, okay, I'd rather sit in my sauna like 40 minutes, like 3 days a week, and know that I'm improving my oxygen carrying capacity. I'm increasing my resiliency to stress, and I'm not necessarily depleting my brain of oxygen while I'm in this
Yeah.
environment. And maybe that's a little bit arbitrary, but for me personally, I'm like, I just don't know how I feel about putting on one of those masks that just reduces your oxygen
Yeah.
intake at sea level. I don't think that can necessarily help and trigger those same pathways.
Yeah. You know what? I'm not gonna lie. I tried it a couple times.
Did you?
Yeah, I forgot what it was called. It was this big black mask, and it was big for a hot minute. And I was like, I'll
Yeah.
try. Let's see. I
Yeah.
mean, I'm interested in it, and it just feels like you're suffocating. That's all it feels like.
Right. Right. Yes. I think we like put them on one day in class and I was like, I don't think this is healthy.
Yeah, I think it's like a marketing scam. In some way, it's like,
I think so. I know of people that were like ultra athletes in Gunnison and they would be traveling to like really high altitudes and they would sleep at night in the altitude, the chambers. I don't know the exact name of
yeah,
them, but they would sleep in the chamber at night, so they would kind of get that similar
hmm,
aspect of that like live high, train low that we were talking about.
right,
Although their low elevation was just like 7,000 feet, but
yeah,
they would sleep in that, so they would get some of those adaptations to occur in their body, like the increase in capillary density
yeah,
um and then in turn that would ideally help them in their performance at really high altitudes.
yeah. It's all fascinating. I mean, I one of the clients I train, he lives close to sea level, and we train live virtually. But so I've been here a while, and I said when I come down to see you, we're gonna have a training session. And honestly, I don't know whether it was the placebo effect or not, but I was not tired. And this was
Oh.
we were doing the similar stuff, and I was like, I just don't feel as fatigued. I feel like I have way more oxygen carrying capacity. And I was
Mm.
like, but I left the day before and then trained the next day. So
Okay.
it made sense what you're saying. Like I
Right.
had the benefit at that
Right.
time, and I definitely felt it. I was like, whoa, this is crazy. It's like
Oh yeah,
really
you were
crazy.
probably had like this little high of like
Yeah, that's what
energy,
it
like
did. It was like, man, I'm like, I just don't feel tired. And
right.
he was like, man, I'm struggling. I was like, I don't know. It's not like we were doing anything different when I normally visit. We did the same intensity and stuff, but it was very noticeable. And he was like, this is a
Wow.
performance enhancing drug for you when you come visiting me. This is the
Hey,
PED.
probably.
He was like, I was like,
Oh my gosh. Yes. Well, this actually makes me think of because we were also doing some studies and like, okay, how can we improve the performance, just performance in general, whether it's
yeah,
at altitude or sea level. And so we did some studies like using beetroot juice as activating some of the nitric oxide synthase pathways and improving perfusion through the
yeah,
body. So, I mean, I think you can utilize tools like that to help you when you're trying to go up to altitude too, and
yeah,
just know what tools can be used for what's going to help increase my blood flow to
yeah,
my extremities and help with that oxygen carrying capacity, all of that.
yeah. The cardiac output and stroke volume decrease was surprising to me over time. I
Yes.
would have thought the opposite. They would have increased your cardiac output and, the amount of blood out of your left ventricle of your heart would increase. But you said that decreases over time, even with exposure.
Yeah, in the long run we see the that decrease in the what was I pathway. Sorry.
It's okay.
I lost my train of thought here.
Yeah,
um
no,
I'm sorry.
and I would think that blood volume would increase over time as well.
Right. So one thing we actually see, and I don't think I mentioned this in the chronic adaptations, was actually the mass of red blood cells increases over time. And
Mhm.
that's one of the long-term adaptations of the blood cells, the
Yeah.
chronic adaptations.
I mean, this it's just fascinating. The body is so incredible and what it
Yeah.
does need and what it doesn't need, but also like pretty resilient.
Oh my goodness. Yes.
Like you just
Yes.
put
I
it in different
mean,
environments and it just like, hey, we're gonna adapt to this. The difference is like when I would teach about space, space is really bad for humans. Like it's
oh, I could imagine.
incredibly horrible for humans. I don't know why we're so pumped up about being out there. It's like, I mean, it's venturesome spirit, but exposure to space is like an
Mm,
immediate game change for the human body. Like it
mm.
just like it essentially the lack of gravity. The body's like, do we really need this skeleton? And so
Oh
you
my
mean you just
goodness.
start like literally like shedding bone mineral density. And if you don't do anything weight bearing, it's just shedding density. I mean, it's crazy. Your body would
Oh, it
rather you
makes
be a floating
sense.
mass of nothing than be
Oh my
exposed to
gosh.
that. It's crazy. And all the radiation and what that does
Yes.
to your body, it's crazy what happens. It's why you have to exercise so much in
Yes.
space. The amount of volume you have to exercise in space is incredible to
Oh
try to
my.
limit the adaptation, which is very negative to the body.
Wow.
It's
So you're just
crazy.
fighting this uphill battle to try to
Literally.
just like tolerate it.
Just to
Wow.
survive is such an uphill
Right.
battle. And now they have people going into space for a year at a time. I think Scott Kelly is one of the astronauts who did it first, and he was there for a year. And they
Oh
measured
my
his
goodness.
telomeres and seeing the differences, how it changed his DNA being in
Really?
space. And it's just it's
Wow.
an unforgiving environment. And
Oh my
that's why I
goodness.
think like I'm very interested in space and travel and stuff. And I think colonization in Mars will be very difficult. It will not be a Four Seasons resort. I mean, you're going to have to live underground because the radiation is so severe in space. You just can't be like exposed to that on a regular
Oh
basis.
my
Get
gosh.
cancer like quickly. I mean, it's like,
Oh yeah. That's like next level stress. Like we're talking
right,
high altitudes as stressful here, and then you're getting like your whole
right,
environment is
right.
just against you.
And even like
Wow.
Everest, right, and stuff. You get so high, then you could get altitude blindness, right? And
Yeah,
you could
yeah.
you're hot closer to the sun, right? The reflection, the whole thing. I mean, there's a lot of negative things that actually start happening the higher you get.
Right. Right. like high altitude, like pulmonary edema too.
Yeah.
That's a huge, I mean, that's when your altitude sickness has gone way too far and
Mm.
you probably should have gone to sea level a while
A
ago.
while
But
ago, yeah.
that's, yeah, I mean, that's a huge one. And that can definitely, it's a very hard one to recover from if someone does
Mm.
experience that without having the right resources and medical care right away.
So it could be pretty damaging long term, is what you're saying for that, or like,
Yeah, I mean, yeah, if it's not taken care of like pretty quickly, which typically when you're in a really high
yeah.
altitude environment, you aren't really that close to many
Oh.
resources, you know? And so if someone's getting to the point where they're experiencing high altitude pulmonary edema, maybe like coughing up blood or
Mm-hmm.
you know, having not able to breathe really at all, it's really hard. A lot of people unfortunately die from it,
Yeah.
but if you don't have medical attention immediately, it can be very deadly.
Yeah. Oh man. Crazy stuff. Well, Lexi, thank you
Yeah.
so much for giving me some of your
Yeah.
time and for us to chat about all things high altitude. It's just a fascinating conversation, really about the
Yeah.
science of the body. So,
Oh my goodness. Isn't it incredible? I just love learning about like what we're capable of and
yeah,
it's
most
it's
definitely.
amazing.
It makes me think of too, like genetics, like will there be a time when um an adaptation is a gene therapy to say, hey, like, this person's just
Mm.
resistant to high altitude, you know.
Right.
When will that's a future that's probably going to happen. It's probably going to
Probably
happen,
so.
right?
Oh,
I
that's
mean,
kind of
can you
cool to think
imagine?
of.
There's a whole thing with epigenetics and gene therapy. It's like, for people to adapt in different environments.
Hmm.
There's a great book that's actually a lot about this. It's a science fiction book. It's called Seven Eves. It's
Oh,
a
okay.
very big book. It's gigantic. It's like 800 pages or something, but it covers like 5,000 years of in this book. I mean, it's this fiction book about the Earth is basically getting destroyed and people are living on this asteroid belt or they live underwater. Underwater is a whole nother thing,
Oh yeah, that's the whole
right?
yeah,
That's a whole nother
totally.
adaptation if you were to live underwater for a prolonged period
Yes.
of time. And just the epigenetics, the things that humans would have to do to survive and
Right.
become like, would that genetic change be humans evolving to have some sort of capacity to breathe underwater over time or
See, like
whatever,
crazy. Yeah,
over a
crazy
long,
to think
long
about.
period of time, type of thing.
Right.
Um,
Totally.
but who knows? I mean, the body is so incredible that prolonged exposure to something will either kill you or will provide some interesting genetic line of changes to the
Right.
body that would almost seem like superhuman abilities for that.
Seriously. Seriously. It's incredible.
Yeah, no, that's why I love training and exercise because I think you already have a power. Like
Yeah.
when you expose your body to resistance, whatever that metric is, or your body changes. It goes, oh, okay, we're going to get stronger because now this is a demand that we've placed on it for that.
Right.
It's I always tell this to people is like the concept of hormesis, in a sense of like
Yes.
if a tree is grown in a dome and it has no wind resistance, it doesn't live that long. The tree dies. But
Right.
tree grown out in just nature lives for a long, long time because the wind is causing resistance against the leaves and the bark of the tree, and that's kind of a metaphor for life. You need to have resistance to
Yes. I
grow.
love that.
Right? You
I
can't
love
just
that.
live
Yeah.
your life in a dome, and you got to get out there
Mm.
and have some type of resistance for that. And high altitude is a form of growth in that sense.
Yes, 100%. Oh my goodness. I couldn't agree with you more.
Most definitely. Thank you so much for
Mhm.
your time. Please let everyone know like how they can connect more with your information and what you're talking about, Lexi.
Yes, yes. So you can find me at heronholistics.com. I also have an Instagram account at Heron Holistics. And yeah, those are the main places you can find me. I work one-on-one with clients and do mineral testing and functional lab testing. I'm also happy to consult in helping individuals prepare for altitude endeavors and things like that.
Wonderful. Thanks so much for your time, Lexi. Appreciate it.
Thank you for having me, Dr. Darian.